the tech is being fixed, I'll just introduce our panel and introduce our speakers. This is a 75-minute panel. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes to talk, and each will go in sequence, and then we'll save all the question and answers at the end for about 15 minutes we'll have for all of that. So this session is called Genomes and the Human Person. Our first speaker will be Professor Chris Baglow, who is a professor of the practice in the Department of Theology here at Notre Dame, and the director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life, Science, and Religion Initiative.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So I don't have a wonderful TA like you have, Teresa, so I'm going to do my best. So thank you very much for coming and for welcoming me. I'd like to begin by kind of laying out some interesting new discoveries about human origins and the history of hominin species on our planet. And to do that, I'll begin in Spain. The cave of La Pasiega in Cantabria, which is a region of northern Spain, is home to numerous examples of Paleolithic cave art dating from 36,000 to 23,000 years old. It was discovered in 1911, and its paintings or its images have been closely studied for over a century when, in February of 2018, it was announced that one of these paintings, one quite unlike the rest, had been tested using uranium-thorium dating methods. The testing revealed that this, as you can see, I guess, on your right here, scalariform or ladder-like image was not 36 to 23,000 years old, but 65,000 years old, making it the oldest in the cave and also predating the arrival of Homo sapiens in Spain by 15,000 years. The latter image, it seems, is of Neanderthal origin. This hypothesis was strengthened by the discovery of the outline of a hand of the same age, as well as a trademark convention of Neanderthal self-ornamentation, pigment-stained and pierced shells, which were even older than the ladder and the hand images. Now, at the time of this discovery, I was writing a chapter of my book, Faith, Science, and Reason, entitled The Emergence of the Image, God and the Sciences of Human Origins. And in January 2018, I had written a dismissal of Neanderthals as being persons, capable of understanding and freedom. I included the judgment of paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall. He said, "We find nothing in the technological record of the Neanderthals to suggest that they were symbolic thinkers." As a species, Homo neanderthalensis seems to have fully participated in the hominin trend over time toward more challenging behaviors and toward more subtle and intricate relationships with the environment. It certainly participated in the hominin trend toward bigger brains, and possibly taking this tendency to its most extreme expression. If you don't know, Neanderthal brains were bigger than our own. But behaviorally, there was no qualitative break with the past. The Neanderthals were simply doing what their predecessors had done, if apparently better. In other words, they were like their ancestors, only more so. We are not. We are symbolic. But this new discovery in Cantabria stopped me dead in my compositional and indeed my philosophical tracks. Cave images, I had always thought, are symbolic in every way that human language is, and symbolism is a hallmark of personhood. I agreed with the Jewish phenomenologist Hans Jonas that, quote, "In the makers of the cave images, we discover creatures who enjoy the mental and corporeal freedom we term human, who also give names to things, that is, have language." So after floundering for about 3 weeks, looking fruitlessly for some challenge to come from the scientific community, I added this to the chapter. As we end our tour of hominin evolution and our investigation of the human difference, we must humbly recognize that our understanding of human prehistory is fragmentary. The sciences of human origins deal with a radically incomplete fossil and artifact record, and important discoveries may be just around the corner. Perhaps we will one day discover that, at some point, Neanderthals also began to exhibit the human difference. It is not out of the question, for science or for faith, that we will one day discover remains that would reveal that they, or perhaps some previously undiscovered hominin species, also crossed the threshold from hominin to human. If so, we could happily add them to our account as yet another example of the human difference, Nothing within our Christian faith would prohibit us from recognizing him as a brother, not biologically perhaps, but spiritually in his capacity for truth and freedom. That's called covering your ass. But anyway, sorry. Questions lingered, however, despite covering my backside, questions lingered in my mind about Neanderthal rationality and personhood. And my thoughts about it had gone to the farthest back burner when, this summer, a new paper was produced, along with a Netflix documentary entitled Cave of Bones, about Homo naledi, a hominin species, the fossils of which were discovered in the Rising Star cave system of South Africa by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team back in 2015. Berger, John Hawkes, and Agustin Fuentes make the claim in the documentary in the paper that naledi intentionally and ritualistically buried their dead in the cave and even left meaning-making scratches on the cave walls, and that they did this, brace yourself, about 340,000 years ago. The scratchings were startling to me because they look so very much like those made by humans 73,000 years ago on an ochre plaque found in Blombos Cave, about 700 miles away from Rising Star. Berger's claims about these findings have been hotly debated, and by no means have they elicited unanimous agreement within the scientific community, where many are skeptical. Perhaps the etchings in Rising Star were made by Homo sapiens much later. They have yet to be dated. Maria Martina Torres, who in 2021 discovered the earliest ritual Homo sapiens burial, dating to 78,000 years ago, has observed a lack of ritual articulation of the bodies in Rising Star. And she calls that articulation the ultimate test of deliberate burial. Nevertheless, it seems that at least the Cantabrian ladder image requires reflection among those of us who see in symbolic activity a hallmark of rationality. Last year at this conference, I remarked on the distinct nature of symbolism as we find it in human language. Somewhere in Africa, I said, quote, signals become signs and symbols. I'm not going to quote myself for the entire talk, I promise. Anyway, signals become signs and symbols, and sounds became human language. A network that made humans able to interpret objectively their subjective sensual interpretation of the world. Animals have nervous systems that produce meanings. Language is a new system that produces understanding of those meanings, of all meanings, even ones not significant to me living in my environment. The symbol-making linguistic human animal sees the world as a totality, I said, and can raise the question of what or who grounds the world and causes it to be from beyond it. God is truth and love, and the linguistic meaning-making animal images God because she can know the truth and because she can love freely. As the Catechism says, possessing the dignity of a person who is not just something but someone, capable of self-knowledge, of self-possession, and of freely giving herself and entering into communion with other persons. This is true, potentially, of embryonic humans. Actually, it's there, but not actualized. Of unconscious humans, as I was just about 9 hours ago. And humans are impeded by physical conditions from executing their rational, linguistic personhood. In the words of Joseph Ratzinger back in 1972, the clay became man at the moment in which a being for the first time was capable of forming, however dimly, the thought God. So, did at least some Neanderthals make the breakthrough to that? To personhood, sharing our dignity, and capable of saying thou to God. I think there is nothing in our faith that would be an obstacle to accepting them as such. Indeed, we interbred with them, and all Caucasians present here possess some percentage of their genome. For the rest of this paper, I want to suggest that there's a third way of interpreting the Pasiega ladder image, and maybe even the Rising Star etchings if they are authentically naledi, that allows us not to overcome, but to at least to qualify, to inflect, the rational or non-rational binary. For the sake of speculation, let's suppose that these non-Homo sapien artifacts bear a special, very special form of pre-rationality. that places them near the human threshold, preparatory to linguistic personhood, but not yet possessing its dignity and capacities. To do so, we will draw on two guides that we won't often find together: the doctor of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, and his theory of phantasms, and the post-Christian novelist and erstwhile philosopher Cormac McCarthy and his theory of the unconscious. The key to joining their insights is simply the recognition that the human body has an evolutionary history that was mammalian and then primate and then hominin before it was ever rational. St. Thomas didn't know about that history or the historical connection between ourselves and the rest of the animal kingdom, but what he said meshes very, very finely with it. So for Aquinas, intellectual activity is grounded in what he mysteriously called the turn to the phantasm. I know Halloween was just a couple days ago, but don't think those kind. He famously said that we could not engage in abstract thought without turning to the phantasms. A phantasm means the likeness of a particular formed in the imagination. In my case, a memory of Da Vinci's Vitruvian man drawing serves as a phantasm when I hear or think of the word humanity. All of us do this. It is inescapable. When you try to think of catness, you will think of a cat, or many cats. You will turn to the phantasm, the image that you have. But paradoxically, the memory of this drawing, which is quite particular and only male, helps open the expansive vistas of human nature to my mind. It's almost as if the imagination, which St. Thomas teaches as a bodily, biological power, we now know to refer to it as a neurological power, is kind of like the footpad of the intellect, which has to strike the diving board of a remembered thing, of an image, before it can plunge into rational comprehension of the thing. Therefore, says St. Thomas, the activity of the intellect is common to soul and body, not just the soul. So given that imagination is bodily, a brain function, must we suppose that it only exists in Homo sapiens? We need only consider the copious observation of obvious dreaming done by animals, as varied as dogs and octopods. In his 2019 documentary, Making Contact, biologist David Scheel shared this 1-minute video he took of an octopus during sleep. Is it moving? Whoops. Oh, maybe it's not. Let's see if this will do it. Ah, alas. Well, I'll just describe it to you. In the video, what actually occurs is while the octopus is sleeping, it starts to change its colors in the way it does when it's preying on things. And then after that, changes its color to that colors in which it camouflages itself so it can feed on what it's found, right? Although Immanuel Kant denied it, by the late 19th century, the faculty of imagination in other animals had been observed and theorized about by great pioneers of cognitive science such as George Romanes and William Lauder Lindsay. Charles Darwin saw it even before they did. He said, as dogs, cats, horses, and probably all the higher animals, even birds, have vivid dreams, we must admit that they possess some power of imagination. What images occupy animals as they dream? Well, what else could it be but the sensual meanings provided by their environments? Images of prey, images of threats, of mates, of offspring, of troop members, maybe images of deceased mother dogs or father chimps. Octopods dream of juicy crabs, chimps dream of juicy figs. And while animals dream, they act out waking-like behaviors. So spiders move their spinnerets as if they're weaving when they are in REM-like sleep. Dogs seem to hunt. With all this in mind, what might the dreams of creatures have been whose bodies and activities were so much like ours? Upright walking, prosocial behaviors like caring for the elderly, breastfeeding, manufacturing tools, building hearths and homes. For them, the phantasms would have been essential to solving problems related to these. In fact, there are myriad instances of problems solved by human beings by what they see in dreams. And here we can turn to Cormac McCarthy and his sole work of philosophy, a 2017 essay entitled The Kekule Problem, Where Did Language Come From? Here he tells the story of the German organic chemist August Kekule, and I'm going to quote McCarthy. He was trying to arrive at the configuration of the benzene molecule and not making much progress when he fell asleep in front of the fire and had his famous dream of a snake coiled in a hoop with its tail in its mouth, the Ouroboros of mythology, and woke exclaiming to himself, "It's a ring. The molecule is in the form of a ring." McCarthy then asks why the unconscious mind speaks to us in images and not in words. Why the images, metaphors, pictures, he says. Why the dreams, for that matter? He defines the unconscious as Aquinas might were he living today. It is a biological system before anything else, he says. To put it as pithily as possible and as accurately, the unconscious is a machine for operating an animal. And all animals possess it. Thank you. It has a totally evolutionary history, unlike language. Language, McCarthy recognizes with refreshing honesty, is an anomaly. Animals signal, for sure, but what their so-called proto-language lacks is, quote, the central idea of language, that one thing can be another thing. Surely some animals possessed unconscious systems that didn't help them out, or things changed and then they stopped helping, and those animals aren't around anymore. But there is no natural selection at work in the evolution of language. He'd ask, did language meet some need? No. The other 5,000 plus mammals among us do fine without it. But useful? Oh yes. Language has been around for maybe 100,000 years, but the unconscious, millions, and maybe even hundreds of millions. And now we might have a path to begin approaching the Neanderthal personhood question. Living in an environment like our own, with bodies very much like our own, dreaming things that offered solutions to problems, images familiar and strange, Neanderthals learned in intuitive, non-linguistic, pre-rational ways some extremely helpful things. Maybe that shell beads painted the color of blood makes one seem more formidable to those who might attack. Or a dream might leave an image elegant enough that one might take some of that shell bead ochre and sketch it out on a cave wall. Why? Well, maybe the image is useful, maybe it's not. The latter image is just that. It's an image, not necessarily a symbol. Dreams give us things unintelligible but entrancing that motivate us powerfully, and we can't always tell why. We do know that Neanderthal was aware of and tended toward good housekeeping. We find neat arrangements in their dwellings. Neanderthals also tended to care for the elderly and powerless of their kin, as they did in the case of Nandi, a Neanderthal fossil found in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, which was severely disabled. But these are all attributable to animal drives, undoubtedly animated by the imagination. They do not require symbolic thinking to be explained. Neither do burials. Every Neanderthal burial that has been discovered bears the same ambiguities of non-ritual articulation as does Lee Berger's discoveries. Hominin species are highly social, and as animals, they had emotions such as grief. A burial could be about not seeing your baby's corpse rotting away or carried off by cave lions. But what we do not find on the top and on the left here are the burials like the humans did in Russia 32 to 28,000 years ago, with many ritual signs. So, might the unconscious have been subject to divine providence in its evolution in such a way that, in encountering reality without objective understanding, hominins with the rudiments of thought were being delicately, or having their minds, their brains I should say, delicately woven into the tapestry of phantasms necessary for the human difference. A special gift from the one who, before he formed humanity in the womb, he knew us and our needs. Hominins still living in an environment not yet seen as a cosmos, but slowly being informed by pictorial impressions. Hominins living closely connected to others, even in ways that seem clearly sacrificial, but not yet with a transcendent sense of love, of moral responsibility. And all the while, the brain was being slowly shaped, carefully crafted for the great moment at which flesh would become word. when self-awareness would become self-reflection, when a delight in the safety of symmetry would become an appreciation for beauty. One day, their dreams would flower into those of the prophet Ezekiel, those of Joseph, son of Jacob, and the dream of the Galilean carpenter, who was Joseph's namesake. So I will conclude with the words of the prophet Joel, "Your old men shall dream dreams." Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm so happy to be here. As Father Terry mentioned, I did my undergraduate here, and I come to this conference every single year, so it's a little bit of a dream of mine to finally be a presenter instead of just a student in attendance. So again, as Father Terry said, did my undergrad here. I'm currently a student, and I show this, first of all, I show off my cute baby bump with my lab coat, which is one of my best photos ever. But also to say, I am not a theologian. I am not a philosopher. I did double major in philosophy, but I didn't take any philosophy of science classes. I'm merely here as a PhD student in the sciences. I am in the molecular genetics and microbiology program. Okay. Which is a fancy way of saying that I study poop, basically, and I study what we can learn about our biology and the bacteria in our gut from poop. But I'm not going to talk about my research specifically today, although if anyone has a question about it, I do have a slide and would love to talk about it. But today I'm going to be talking about basically what we can learn about God and how God's hand is evident in the world from the gut microbiome. So it's kind of a overview of where we're going to be headed today. I'm going to go through a couple of different case studies of how I see examples from my own field of the gut microbiome and how it makes evident themes that we find in John Paul II's theology of the body of how the symbolic nature of creation points to the creator. And like I said, since I'm not a philosopher, I'm not going to be, and there's extensive scholarship in this area of the intersections between philosophy and science and religion. I'm really going to offer some reflections on whether taking, as a scientist, I take an approach based in the modern scientific hermeneutic, whether that is also compatible with approaching the world in the manner of John Paul II in his theology of the body of seeing the world as sacramental. Okay, so I'd like to open with this beautiful quote from John Paul II's theology of the body, where he talks about how the human body points to the communion of persons in the Trinity. Also, yeah, this is my daughter. It is her nap time right now. She may need intervention. I have backup, so we'll see how long she lasts. Okay. We can then deduce that man became the image and likeness of God, not only through his own humanity, but also through the communion of persons which men and women form right from the beginning. The function of the image is to reflect the one who is the model, to reproduce its own prototype. Man becomes the image of God, not so much in the moment of solitude as in the moment of communion. Right from the beginning, he is not only an image of which the solitude of a person who rules the world is reflected, but also, and essentially, an image of an inscrutable divine communion of persons. So basically what we're hearing here is a description of a world in which our bodies are more than just some material accident of some random assemblage of parts, but rather the structure of our own bodies, of our own sexuality in particular, is an expression and an image of the Creator. And in particular, our own bodies are incredible in that we are the highest form of creation and that we most beautifully and perfectly reflect the Trinity in how, in man and women, and how we're created in sex bodies. The individual, it doesn't make sense. If you look at an individual man and his biology, it only makes sense in the context of a woman. And in coming together and in being in communion, we reflect the Trinity. Okay. So perhaps in apparent supposed contrast to this, again, I'm speaking purely in terms of public perception. Like I said, there's a lot of philosophical discourse on this already. I'm not going to get into that. But purely from the perspective of your average person, this appears to be a competing worldview where we have the modern scientific paradigm. Show this image of evolution. We're all, I think, familiar with natural selection. But as a microbiologist, I'm not usually thinking in terms of evolution so much in terms of probabilistic interactions and how everything I ask, is this trait, is this reaction, how is it favored or unfavored given the underlying structure, and it has to result from some kind of probability. And when I do statistical testing of asking if the observations I make are real or not, I ask, is it a result of a biological distribution or like a random one. So approaching this world from the perspective of everything results from molecules interacting with each other. I have a schematic here of, we have evolution as like the macro level, but below that we have a level of genes and populations, which are selected for because of competing molecular interactions, which in turn result from atomic and subatomic interactions of things hitting each other. And the ways in which things react result from how probable it is that an electron will be in a certain place at a certain time and result in the phenomena that we see. Oh, that is supposed to be the end. Okay. So to move into the science, I'd like to tell you a story. So this is me about a year ago. There's Maristella. And this is at Cold Spring Harbor in New York. As someone who entered graduate school in 2019, I did not attend my first conference until several years into my graduate program. And at this conference, someone came up and gave a talk and showed this image. And I would probably give $10 to anyone who can guess what this image is. So this is actually an image of plaque. This is someone, a scientist somewhere, took a piece of floss, stuck it in someone's mouth, and then stained that plaque for bacteria. And so what you can see here is this really beautiful structure. So plaque is actually biofilm, and biofilm is a community of bacteria that are all living together and doing different things. And they build like this little wall around themselves. It's basically a bacteria commune, and they all live happily together and work together. And what I want you to see is that you can see the purple bacteria form these long chains. I think those are Coronabacterium. And then at the end of those chains, you have other species. The scientist who's describing this image said they called them corn cobs. You have little bacteria corn cobs where you have the orange bacteria on the outside, the green within that, and then the purple bacteria in the middle. And as a scientist, if I were to describe, why it is that bacteria look this way, I would say, well, in your mouth, it's an oxygenated environment. Not all bacteria like oxygen. Not all of them can grow in the presence of oxygen. And the purple bacteria are actually, they're not able to tolerate oxygen. And so they're on the inside of the biofilm. And on the outside of the biofilm, you have the green bacteria, and especially the orange ones, which are fine in the presence of oxygen and will grow and actually protect the inside. So that's a scientific explanation, but what I see is this is really beautiful and really cool. And I wanted to use this image to introduce you to the fact that you have a microbiome. So if I was talking to scientists, they'd be like, oh yeah, the microbiome, whatever, but not talking to scientists here, so I get to rant about how cool this is. So this is actually an image of your tongue. So the microbiome is a community of organisms, such as bacteria, fungi, and viruses, that actually live and colonize every surface of your body. So your skin has a microbiome, your mouth has a microbiome, your lungs have a microbiome, your gut has a microbiome, which is what I study. This is a picture of, actually this is cheating, this is a mouse microbiome. You can see that there's blue cells that are actually the intestinal villi, and then the red is all the bacteria that are all living happily in your intestine. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is in learning about the system and learning about the way the different communities of bacteria interact with humans, I noticed a couple of really amazing things. So again, this is the image that I showed previously of bacteria in the gut. And what a couple of papers have shown is that actually the bacteria in your gut are required for your immune cells to function in the way that they're supposed to. Again, I'm trying to keep this as high level as possible, but so you think of the immune system, there are different cells in the immune system. One of those is T cells, and there's a specific form of helper T cell called a regulatory T cell, and they actually are involved in preventing inflammation. Their job is to go after an inflammatory event and tell everyone, okay, calm down, don't need inflammation anymore. I know it's your nap time. And what's amazing is that in order for these cells to actually proliferate at the levels that they are supposed to, they require signals from bacteria. So bacteria living in the gut primarily eat fiber because that's what escapes our own digestion and makes it to them. I know, you're so much fun. And in the process of fermenting fiber, they produce various byproducts, one of which is this molecule called butyrate. And what I'm showing in the schematic is that butyrate will diffuse from the bacteria in the outer part of the gut and make it to the bottom of the intestinal crypts where stem cells are, and they'll make it to the immune cells, which live at the bottom, and they'll induce naive T cells to become regulatory T cells. Another paper which came out this past year showed that if you take mice that don't have any bacteria, they have been made so they don't have any bacteria in their gut, and you give them bacteria of a baby mouse and you keep them in that state all the way through adulthood, that you actually also make it so the immune system remains basically at the level of a baby mouse. So especially the most important cell that was impacted was these regulatory T cells, but there are other cell types that are impacted as well. And what they showed is that when you get these mice sick, they give them basically mouse typhoid fever, then they are much more susceptible because they don't have an immune system that developed properly because they didn't have the right bacteria. So now maybe we're starting to see something that maybe more resembles what John Paul II described, where we have a world in which there's this fundamental structure of community and relationship, and if we end up in a place where we're not in the appropriate relationship with the world around us, then we end up diseased and we end up sick. So this indicates that, first of all, John Paul II talked about our sexual biology as reflecting God, but this shows that even at the level of our gut and our bacteria and the relationships that we have with them, there's still this same reflection of the community of persons relationship. And yes, I just compared the Trinity to the way that we interact with the gut bacteria, but God is the one who made all these things, so it was him, not me. Okay, and in case you still weren't convinced that your gut microbiome was important, here is my obligatory slide where I show you that if you mess up your microbiome, if there's something that's wrong with it, then it ends up predisposing you to be at a much higher risk of a bunch of different health conditions. And a lot of things that we are dealing with in the modern age that have become a lot more common are hypothesized to be because of the fact that we have antibiotics now, and we have various environmental exposures that our bacteria aren't used to, and we also eat very poorly and very differently from how we used to in the past. So again, emphasizing the importance of having this appropriate relationship. How am I doing on time? Oh, sweet. Okay, so I can't talk about this. All right. This is one of the coolest papers I've ever read. It's a little bit out of my field, but it's amazing, and I did want to talk about it. So there's a whole field of biology of people who study circadian biology, and I have major respect for those people because it means that they get up at 3 in the morning to go sample their mice at that time point. And so this study was looking at, I don't know how they saw this, but basically they noticed that bacteria will change where they are in the gut depending on the time of day. And mice are nocturnal, which means that they're mainly eating food at night. And what they saw is that bacteria like to localize close to the gut during the day, and then would be farther away when the mice are asleep. And as you could imagine, depending on what time of day it is, you need different genes that are active. During the day, you might be eating food, and so you need to express the genes that will result in proteins that let you break down food, that signal your body to absorb it. And so this is an image from that paper where they show basically what normal gene expression looks like throughout a mouse day. And like I just described, we also see bacteria have their own little routine that they go through throughout the day, where I'm pretty sure, it's at night when mice are most active, then the bacteria are much closer to the gut, and you can see they quantified the bacteria that are adherent to the intestine, and then the mice are asleep, and there isn't as much food available, then the bacteria just do whatever. Okay, now for the crazy part. So if you kill all the bacteria, and by giving the mice antibiotics, you actually lose that gene expression that changes throughout the day, and you actually lose some of your own the mouse's own circadian rhythm is actually lost. And this shows that it's not just our own innate biology that's driving things that we need, but it's actually through this interaction with the world around us. And I just have a quote here from the authors in their discussion, just to say again, this is not me making things up. They also talk about this where, again, they use science speak, which I'm not going to read, but basically they're saying that the mouse biology of things that mice need to do to maintain themselves is not independent of environmental signals, but actually all those environmental signals are integrated within the biology of the mouse. Okay, one last example, and then I promise I'm going to try to tie all this together. So this is my favorite. This is the thing that I think is just totally mind-blowingly cool, and I'm so excited that I get to talk about it. So humans make breast milk. Obviously, we're mammals. And we think of milk and we think it has food for our baby. But what's amazing is that actually the third most abundant component of human milk is not for babies. It is actually completely indigestible by humans, and is specifically for bacteria. So the main function of these molecules is actually to basically you can think of it as analogous to fertilizer, and it promotes the growth of this one genus of bacteria called Bifidobacterium. And there's actually a specific species that you only see in babies of this genus, like subspecies Infantis, like subspecies baby. And there's a lot of people who are studying this right now. These molecules are really only became a research interest about like 6 years ago. Is when I started seeing papers about it. Because apparently women aren't cool or something, I don't know. But basically, this is one of the most well-known functions of this, is that they promote the growth of what are presumed to be beneficial bacteria. And these bacteria, we think the reason that they are important is they maybe eat up all the resources in the little baby gut, so that way bad bacteria don't have stuff to eat and a way to kind of get a foothold. Another thing that these bacteria do is they act as decoys, or these molecules do is they act as decoys, and yes, it's Halloween, and use my Star Wars reference here. And these sugars, so basically the outside of your cell is covered, your cells is covered in sugars. And those sugars, you think of like your blood type, that's actually a kind of sugar. And so the HMOs, these milk oligosaccharides, actually look like a bunch of those sugars that are on the outside of intestinal cells. So you can think of a pathogen, some kind of germ, getting into your baby and being like, aha, I'm going to infect this baby and give them diarrhea. But then it sticks to what it thinks is a cell, but it was in actuality one of these sugars, and then it gets washed away. So this is further emphasizing that actually built into our own biology, built into our own structure of how we are created, we are fundamentally, our health is tied to being in relationship and being in communion and interrelationality with other organisms. Okay, so what have I shown you? I've shown you that our own health and normal development and function is actually dependent in a lot in some surprising ways on gut bacteria. And I've also shown you that our own biology built into it has this innate stewardship of bacteria. We produce molecules, we have immune cells that actually specifically cultivate or allow some bacteria to remain and get rid of other ones in order to maintain this right relationship. And so I'd just like to close by returning to this image that I showed you of plaque of this biofilm and say that we talked about how in public common perception, we see the description of the natural world as fundamentally best described in terms of probabilistic interactions as maybe being competing with a more sacramental theological approach. But when I think about it, I think about how this isn't the full picture, that below the level of subatomic interactions, and I'm not going to talk about this because I'm not an expert in it, but those probabilities are actually set by natural laws, and they're set by these universal structures of reality in the ways that are outside of any material thing. And perhaps there's a different way of looking at the world in which we accept and receive reality as it is, where we do see that it is very well described in terms of modern science and the things we've discovered. But that maybe this points to the fact that the fundamental, most baseline structure of things is that we are what we are, and we have become what we are through natural selection, through all these things, through relationship. So for example, in the HMO example, these are two different HMOs. These are actually two different sugars. They have different functions, can be eaten by different bacteria. But what you'll notice is that they're actually the same molecules connected in the same order. It's just the orientation of the bonds is different. And this is an example of isomers. Again, for the non-science people, not getting into that. But to point out that actually, if you want to understand something as a biologist, if I want to understand something and know what it is, I actually don't look at what the constituent parts are. I look at how they're related to each other. And what, for example, in these molecules, what is the relationship with the bonds? In each of these sugars is actually a different relationship of carbon and other atoms, which are themselves different relationships of protons and neutrons, et cetera. And so, what this points to is that, maybe, it's easy, again, this is me approaching this from my own existential angst as a scientist and Catholic, but in wrestling with this, is it right for me to, both maintain, the worldview described by John Paul II of my body is this incredible image of the creator, while also when I go into the lab, then I think about things of, how does this make sense from the perspective of what's selected for? But fundamentally, I think that it's possible to see this through the lens of maybe the fundamental underlying structure of reality is one of relationship, and is one of we are, like I said, we have become what we are what we are through the interrelationality of different things, and through a history of interrelationality and a history of intercommunion. And I'll end with this quote from St. Augustine that inspired me to give this talk, where he says, "Some people, in order to discover God, read books, but there is a great book, the very appearance of created things. Look above you, look below you, read it. God, whom you want to discover, never wrote that book with ink. Instead, he set before your eyes the things that he had made. can you ask for a louder voice than that? Thank you.
So thank you all. It's a privilege to talk to you. Those are two very tough presentations to follow. And I'm privileged to be part of the panel and to have the opportunity to present to you. I am currently a cardiologist, advanced heart failure specialist in Steubenville, Ohio. Before that, I was at one point an undergraduate in biology at Creighton University, and was struck by a presentation regarding Stephen Jay Gould's take on evolutionary theory and radical chance. Those notions took me to graduate school for 3 years at Catholic University to get a master's and halfway to a PhD in philosophy. And then I finally realized it would take too long to do what so many of you do in academia. So I then spent the next 10 to 12 years going to medical school, doing an internal medicine residency, cardiology fellowship, advanced heart failure fellowship, and spent 15 years in heart transplant at Mayo Clinic before moving on to Steubenville. But this notion of chance has haunted me for my whole life, or fascinated me. One other thing I want to say just before I get started, and then I'll move pretty quickly. My wife is here. This is the first time that she's had the opportunity of coming to any presentation I've given. She's taking care of our family and so forth, so I'm very happy to have her here. So we're going to talk about, and this is going to relate to the other two presentations, chance and evolutionary theory, order in nature. How much order are we obliged to see in nature? Are we talking about, when we talk about teleology, are we talking about the teleology of an organism, as Meyer and Monod might refer to as teleonomy? Or are we looking at directionality in a process of natural history? The final result, not to put too fine a point on it, is man in the cards. Are the dice loaded so that we have a linguistic animal with consciousness at the end of the process? Those interactions that Teresa was talking about at a molecular level during the origins of life, are they loaded with probabilities to lead us to man? We'll look at some of the thought of William Paley and Charles Darwin and his interpretation of what I would consider a faulty natural theology that resulted in much mischief with respect to evolutionary theory, and we'll look a bit at St. Thomas Aquinas. To get us focused, Millie, our dog, this is Millie in winter. She's a mini golden doodle, and I can attest to the fact that she dreams of hunting. I see her legs moving. So, evolutionary theory, the classic narrative of it is that you have, and I won't get into the whole complex issue of origins of life, origins of a first cell, and so forth. That's complicated and beyond my expertise, and I'm not sure there's a lot of agreement on it in any case. But you have stable populations of living organisms, and then you have mutations that occur by chance. And then after that, you have, as Teresa was referring to, a chance concomitance of events. The chance mutation interacts by chance with the environment it happens to be in, leading to an advantage for some members of the population, and those are selected out what we call natural selection. And some evolutionary biologists, like Richard Dawkins, for example, would say that process is he would refer to it with the metaphor of a blind watchmaker. But there's some determinism also in his and other evolutionary biologists. Populations then separate and continue to diverge, and we have speciation. So what is chance? does chance mean something that's infrequent? Maybe in Aristotle Physics, Book 2, Chapter 8, that would be suggested. Is chance probabilistic? Does it relate to thermodynamic theories? Does it imply a defect in an organism? We can talk about chance concomitance of causal lineages that are not related and lead to an outcome. Aristotle uses the example of two men meeting in the market. I think it was a payment of a debt that was then transacted, maybe not, but they met by chance. They weren't to meet there. How do we define the goodness of this whole process? Is it good because organisms are acting for their own good? Is goodness just survivability? I mean, that's what many evolutionary biologists would argue. Or is goodness because someone set the whole process in motion and intended us? And do we ask those questions from a philosophical standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, or a theological standpoint? And sometimes maybe mixing those categories are what gets us in trouble. Is there directionality to the history of life? Is there predictability or lack of predictability? So what about chance in St. Thomas? We'll look a little bit at how it relates to primary and secondary causes, failure of secondary causes, how the concept of chance relates to divine providence. Does it fall under divine providence? The answer is yes. There's people much more qualified in the room to discuss that, but it's all over the Summa. It's in his commentary on Aristotle's physics, on the metaphysics. It's in the Summa contra Gentilius. Yes, chance is accounted for. It's chance in nature, but with respect to God, it does fall under, chance events do fall under divine providence. So here's my big question, a question that I've been struggling, and maybe you can help me because it's haunted me for 30 years. How much, or maybe 25, how much are we required to read Providence off the book of nature? If nature is a book that God has written us and for us, and if we can infer the existence of God, and we'll get a little bit more from nature, that's one thing. How much can we infer providence from natural history? Catechism of the Catholic Church says we firmly believe that God is master of the world and of its history, but the ways of his providence are often unknown to us. So I think we all would agree to, in our personal lives and cultural history and in the history of politics and so forth, it's through the eyes of faith we can see divine providence acting, but maybe we couldn't predict that things would come out that way. Is that the same thing with natural history? Or do we need to read in the clues of nature, in genetics, in the fossil record, in convergences of structures? Do we need to read in that a suggestion of providence, of governance from God? So if we look at different theories of evolution, and I'm sorry, this is very simplistic, but I would categorize some as materialist and determinist. Maybe Richard Dawkins might fit into that. Certainly there are many random events, but those random processes ultimately lead you to climb Mount Improbability, as he calls it. So there's an implied directionality through natural selection. He doesn't get into too much why that happens, at least my reading of him, and it's been a while. But there may be some determinism involved, which is obviously different than providence, but it does suggest a directionality. Materialist and random theories of evolution, Jacques Monod, who Pope Benedict or Joseph Ratzinger often uses as an interlocutor in his discussions on evolution. He wrote a famous book called Chance and Necessity. For him, chance was a remarkably, not even rare event, but a unique event, for example, at the start of life, leading ultimately to natural history and human beings. There might be theistic theories of evolution. Asa Gray, who was a contemporary of Darwin, maybe John Haught and others today. Once again, what are we after when we look at nature? How much is requisite of us in terms of reading providence in nature? And what are the presuppositions determining the significance of chance in evolution? William Paley may be considered as a crystallization of a mechanical perfectionist view of living order, building on Newton and deism. What are the implications of chance in a worldview that's mechanical, deterministic, deist? What are the implications for pain, for evil in the world? Is that part of Darwin's difficulty dealing with these issues? For Aquinas, and by the way, I'm happy if anybody wants to email me to send references to these. I didn't incorporate them. So for Aquinas, you have primary and secondary causality. Primary causality through divine action. Secondary causality, there's a cooperation between the two. Divine providence also relates to contingency, chance, evil in particular, in chance events that happen to individual creatures, as well as to the whole process. Again, what is the burden of explanation for natural theology? So here we go. Millie's sitting at attention. So what I think is the most radical challenge in evolutionary theory to a theistic view is the one presented by Stephen Jay Gould. He says in a metaphor, if you play the movie 1,000,000 times, you're going to get 1,000,000 different results. Man is not in the cards. Intelligence, he argues at different points, does not confer a survival advantage. I think you can argue with that, obviously, but that's what he's suggesting. He argues against a teleology in natural history and implies that argument opposes the notion of a benevolent governing creator. He's influenced by Paley. We've already talked about him. Paley gave a natural theology based on a watchmaker god who presumably, and he's more complex than this, but the sort of takeaway message, or the way he's been interpreted, is arguing for a watchmaker god who makes a perfect universe, and this theology doesn't have the apparatus to deal with imperfection. Chance implies that things aren't designed, and this is what Darwin was interacting with. So variations, mutations are unplanned, undesigned. They may be advantageous, may be useless, but they don't imply providence. What does St. Thomas tell us in Summa Contra Gentilius, book 3? Well, contingency is a given of creation, right? Creation is by definition contingent. Chance is a rare event. He's consistent with Aristotle there. He talks about concomitance of non-related causal lines. He talks about chance as an imperfection in the agent. So maybe there's a disadvantageous mutation. Creation is compatible with weakness, with evil. In fact, in a stunning section in, I think it's in 73 or 74, in Summa Contra Gentilius 3, he says creation presupposes evil of one organism in relation to another as they're competing with each other. And why is that? Because the order of the universe as a whole is the greatest order. And while there's a non-competition between primary and secondary causality, for sure, chance as well is governed by providence, And God orders, and this is a theological position. God orders the universe to its greatest order, and indeed the failings or weakness in the process allow for greater goods to emerge. I at one point felt that solved the issue. Chances covered by divine providence, we're done. There's not a problem. And I wrote an article about that in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly. A philosopher, Peter Pagan, who I don't know well, he and I have spoken once, took issue with that at a conference, and he argues for the need to recognize not just that God exists, but to recognize God's wisdom and providence in nature, consistent with a global teleology. So my question again is, how would you read that? How would you read that in the fossil record? How would you read that in the genetics? In the molecular biology? One way of doing this is if you look philosophically, Jacques Maritain, Charles de Koninck, Dr. I'm blanking on his first name, but Smith, all who have ties to Notre Dame, argued from natural philosophy principles and from the principles of metaphysics that there are ontological parameters. Evolution can occur within vegetative space, animal space, and the space of reason. And Simon Conway Morris, who presented here last year, makes a similar argument from the standpoint of biology, that there are convergences in biological structures that support that sort of notion. Still, are we required to marshal that kind of evidence? And if we look at Scripture, it tells us that we know God from the greatness and beauty of created things. De Filius in Vatican I says that God can be known through the natural light of human reason from created beings. We're not talking about a perfectionist universe. We're not talking about irreducible complexity. The Catechism of the Catholic Church does say, and it's a theological position, that ultimately we are destined to come about. The universe is destined for and addressed to man. The universe is a state of journeying towards its perfection, and we call that divine providence. Once again, I ask, do we need to read that off nature? Is that obligate of us? So where are we? We should know God through his creation, okay? We know God's existence through his creation. He created out of nothing. His creation is good. It manifests his power, glory, and beauty, and he speaks to us through his creation, telling us that he is speaking to us. And Revelation tells us that we are intended. But are we obligated to read that intent, that directionality in nature or not? We are not told from Scripture, from the Catechism of the Church, from Vatican I, that creatures cannot develop into new forms or species, that lesser order cannot result in a greater or higher order, that we need to see the irreducible complexity of organisms, that organisms are perfect, and that perfection leads us to know that they are designed by God, that chance cannot play a role in the process, that there cannot be a historical development. We're not told those things. So, coming back to Gould, the analogy of the film. If you play the film 1,000,000 times, it'll result in 1,000,000 different results. Radically different outcomes. Humanity is not in the cards. What if the evidence isn't there from biology? We still have the ontologic parameters that Maritain, de Koninck, and others have laid out for us. And we know that Aquinas' thought is compatible with chance, suffering, and evil in the universe. so my question still remains, how much order and directionality do we need to read off of nature? I'm almost done. Michael Ruse, in a recent fascinating book called Abraham's Dice, has suggests that even if there wasn't, and he's an agnostic or atheist, and yet he has a interesting suggestion that might be compatible with theism. He said, if you have infinite possibilities within parameters, the parameters may be there, but within those parameters there are infinite possibilities. God may have created the universe acting as a primary cause, working with secondary causes, and chance within those organisms and chance interactions amongst those organisms over long periods of time would ultimately lead you to conclude that man would have to come about in a probabilistic way. So, in conclusion, traditional theology, let's say Catholic theology, would say that God can be known through the beauty, the power, and in some way the order of the universe. The fifth way is fascinating in its humility. Right? It's a very humble argument, and I take it as a valid argument, and we don't have time to get into that. An alternate theological position, because I think Gould's position is ultimately theological, and it's in response to William Paley's perfectionist universe. So an alternate theological position is that chance and mistakes in nature discredit the language of nature, corrupting its ability to speak to us of God, perhaps fatally. Within the tradition of the theologic authority, so Catholic thought, not to put too fine a point on it, that authority claims an authority to state that we can approach God through reason alone, and utilizing our intellectual tools to address, and we can use our tools to address this position of Gould's through primary and secondary causality, subsuming chance under the cloak of divine providence, and characterizing the ontologic space in which evolution might occur, using biological convergences to supplement that. And I would suggest, and this is where the challenge of radical contingency to become ascendant again. In other words, if those convergences are not there, or if it came to be that we couldn't rely on those convergences, that this notion that Ruse suggests of infinite possibilities within certain parameters eventually leading to man still suggest that that a theological reading of nature, including chance, can give us an appropriate understanding of divine providence, but without necessarily reading that off nature, if you will. And I'll take a breath. Millie's happy that we're done. And I, again, thank you. There's Millie with my daughters, and thank my wife for being here too. So thank you very much.
All right, we have a microphone in the middle of this aisle. If you want to ask a question to one or more of our speakers, please line up. If you can make sure the mic is on, and then say who you are and where you hail from, that'd be appreciated. We have about 15 minutes for questions.
I think this is on.
It sounds like it.
Okay, good. Thanks. Great talks from all three of you. And John and Teresa's points about scripture and nature being able to be read kind of sharpens a question I have for Chris. So, if there's a prior to the Enlightenment, scriptural interpretation had four different ways: allegorical, literal, anagogical, tropological. But they also believed that to be true of nature, right? And it seems like in the Enlightenment we get just this literal interpretation of both scripture and nature. So, but that suggests that God is symbolically representing God's self to us through nature. And when you were talking about the Neanderthal, you started moving towards symbol, maybe that was what makes us human. But then you very quickly kind of pivoted to rationality. So philosophical question, what would you say the relationship is between symbolic thinking versus rational thinking, or image, sign, all of that? Theologically, I think it means that if all of creation shows forth God, then there is something about symbol that is pretty important for how we reflexively turn. The second theological question, speculative, would you be surprised if Neanderthals were there with us in the resurrection?
Can you just give us your name, please, so they can respond to a name?
Jeffrey Bishop, St. Louis University.
Hey, Jeffrey. Yeah, so I did, just for the sake of time, not spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between symbolism and rationality. But I do think that the key to see the connection between them is language. Because in language, something stands for something else. And you have the interpenetration of the word with the reality, or rather the reality and the word with one another, right? And I think that happens in images too. And maybe even sounds. I mean, we could talk about all of those kinds of things. So I do think that you're absolutely correct. What I was kind of trying to get to was that perhaps what we see interesting intimations of in Neanderthal is evidence of the fact that, in a sense, our rich imagination, which makes our symbolism possible, has its own evolutionary history that's outside of language. And I would not be surprised, in fact, I'm hopeful to see my brother-in-law in heaven. Sorry, he's a good guy, though.
Richard Dorflinger. Dr. Schirger, I wondered if you could comment on, I guess they call them the anthropic coincidences. One thing that interested me was that Jacques Monod, who was, no one is more of an atheist or committed to radical contingency than he, and he concluded that the development of man is almost infinitely unlikely. That, you can try 1,000,000 times to get a dip, but we only had one time. And yet, here we are. Even the physical constants, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, gravity, they're all seemingly independent of each other. We can't find any reason why they are the way they are. If they were a fraction off, matter itself would be impossible, not to mention animals and man and so on. And because Catholic scientists they agree with this atheist Monod and say yes, and therefore it's extremely unlikely that we could have resulted from chance. Of course, in reaction to that, some atheist scientists went into a kind of a tizzy and said, we have to develop this whole theory of an infinity of alternate universes to explain why we happen to be in the 1 out of 1,000,000 that has us. The reaction of one Catholic physicist to that has been, therefore you have to hypothesize an infinity of unknowable universes in order to explain away one unknowable God. I just wondered what you think of this interesting convergence between the greatest atheist reasoner of this of all time and Catholicism.
So thanks, Richard. Nice to see you again too. I won't be able to answer this adequately. I will say this, that first of all, physics isn't my area of expertise, so that's an easy answer. But the whole notion, let's say in Monod, of chance being such a unique thing. I mean, does that argue for providence or does it argue against providence? I mean, it might. I mean, you might take it to argue for a divine intervention or a divine plan. Even though it seems to be very, very chancy in nature. So this notion of, you know, what Michael Ruse was writing about, of infinite possibilities within parameters, right? But they're still infinite within it, leading, ultimately having to lead to human beings. And that if you just, you know, if you're there long enough, it's going to lead to human beings ultimately. I mean, it's another way of talking about multiverses, except more in the biological world, I think. I would love to hear theologians discuss about infinite possibilities of creation in the mind of God, and why God chose to create as he did, and whether that would be consistent with that sort of notion of infinite possibilities in nature. So Etienne Gilson speculates along those lines, actually. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I don't want to take time from others, and maybe we can chat afterwards a little bit.
My name is Michael Waldstein, Franciscan University. John, your central question about can we read a plan of God in the study of nature? It seems to me that Scripture contains both an affirmation and a negation of that. Compare some of the Psalms that speak about God taking care of us. Paul's sermon at the Areopagus, where God's providential care for nourishing us, and etc., is talked about. But then take the book of Job and the startling incomprehensibility of events that befall Job. Or think of Peter, who thinks he has figured out the teleology of the Messiah. And he confesses Jesus is the Messiah, and the first thing Jesus says is, I'm going to be crucified. And then Peter says, let not that happen to you. So he knows the teleology. Then he gets called Satan. So both things are there. And I think we have to make sense of that fact, that both things are there. That trust is possible, reasonable, but it's not an overview that we gain. I wonder if you could react to that.
Thank you very much. I can't add anything to that. Thank you, Dr. Waldstein. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Pietro Stroik. I have two simple questions. First, what is the relationship between chance and development? And what is there a necessity to personhood that comes from development? In other words, is personhood necessarily developmental? And therefore, is chance in a necessary relationship with personhood? Thank you. Whomever would like to comment on that, I'm not sure.
In his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, Thomas actually says that chance is in the universe so that all of the potential forms in matter could be actualized. So when you talk about development, the idea that many unusual things happen, you know what I mean, where lines of causality intersect, and for me that's what chance is. Chance is when two lines of causality intersect to produce something that they would not have ordinarily produced within their proper range. So you might think of a man who goes to dig a grave and finds a buried treasure. The person who buried the treasure didn't intend for him to find it. And he didn't intend to find it. But there's an effect. He's a very wealthy man now, right? So of course chance comes into divine providence, right? God, who is the cause of all being and therefore of all goodness, right? Makes it such, the universe such, that all the various ways in which his goodness can be realized are realized. Although it takes millions and billions of years, right? And maybe not all of them, I'm sure. No one can say that for certain. In terms of personhood certainly, I think, at a certain point, agreeing with the church's teaching on the soul, right, is not subject to what we would call evolutionary development. But the material body, the biology and neurology necessary for it certainly has, right? So despite one of my, I'm from New Orleans, one of my favorite Disney movies is Princess and the Frog. But frogs really can't talk or dance or any of those things. They just don't have the stuff for it. They don't have the physiology for it. They don't have the brains for it. You need to have all those things in order to do, right, what humans do as persons. Last year, one of, who am I thinking of? Phil Sloan asked me the question about upright posture. Very important for what it means to be human. The fact that we don't just communicate with words, we communicate with all kinds of facial gestures, right? All those things. What would it be if we were on all fours? What would personhood, you know what I mean? How well would we actually be able to even actualize that personhood? So.
Hello, a question for Dr. Schirger. Is that correct pronunciation?
Schirger.
Schirger, okay. I'm Phoebe Wang from Christendom College. So I'm wondering, how would your conclusions change depending on our understanding of chance? So you have on the one hand the chance is, the result of determined true causality that we just don't subjectively understand, or the more colloquial, like chance is a mysterious force that we can't comprehend, almost an uncaused cause. So I guess one is more deterministic, one is more like true randomness. How would that understanding of chance impact your conclusions?
So in one of the slides, I put up several, different meanings of chance. We could hold a weekend seminar on the different notions of chance, and there's probably people here more qualified. I mean, there's the, as Dr. Baglow just mentioned, two lines of causality not intended towards an outcome. That's classic it's all over Aristotle, and St. Thomas comments on it. Book 2 of the Physics, chapter 8, and leading up to it. That's, those are big discussions. Yves Simon has wonderful discussions on that. Whether you look at chance in that way or as a rare event, so you wouldn't know that. If you look at chance as just something that we should know but can't know, sort of a Laplacian notion of chance. I mean, in the end, or whether you look at chance from a quantum perspective, if it's intrinsic to reality, I think they all have in common that we can't really know from this set of data what's going to occur in the future. And so I think, I believe all of those notions of chance could be accounted for by Aquinas' notion of providence. So in my mind, the fact that Aquinas accounts for chance and providence is a really big move, because other natural theologians don't, like Paley, for example. I don't know, Teresa or Christopher?
We've got about 1 minute left in our questionnaire. We're 6 minutes into our break, so maybe one last question, or 1.5.
Thanks. Question for Teresa on her research. Given that scientists are continuing to understand more of the complexity of the microbiome, what are kind of the research avenues that you're seeing develop here? Are we just going to try to reduce antibiotic usage as much as possible? Kind of what are the next steps that you're seeing in your field?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a lot of different things. So I will say that the gut microbiome had its big moment of popularity about 10 years ago, and it's starting to go out of style. So we're seeing more, the big things people moving into now are like the gut-brain axis, something I didn't talk about, but there's all these fascinating interactions between gut bacteria and things that happen in the gut that then travel to the brain and then go back to the gut that people are really interested in. In terms of how to manage the fact that we have, we see all these diseases that result from gut bacteria feed that stuff. I mean, there's lots of different approaches. I know, so people have tried doing probiotic bacteria, just can you give people the right bacteria back? But that hasn't worked very well because actually bacteria don't really colonize unless they have the right environment. So now I think people are moving more into more context-dependent, personalized medicine type directions of maybe the right bacteria are dependent on your circumstances, and also maybe the route is more to restore the right conditions for good bacteria. So maybe reducing C-sections, because C-sections can actually cause the disrupted microbiome. Encouraging people to eat more healthfully, to eat the kinds of foods that will promote bacteria. And so that's actually what I study, is the kinds of foods that maybe promote good bacteria. So I like to think that my research is, at the forefront of these kinds of issues.
Well, thank you. Just one thought to leave you with, and maybe you can ask Teresa about this afterwards. We asked if Chris Baglow's Neanderthals cousins would be in heaven. Will the gut microflora be a part of the resurrected body? Let us thank our speakers one more time.